four corners of the earth and the far corridors of history. Dateline, World War II. October 1942, the Pacific. While Guadalcanal may be the United States' first major land offensive in this war, the fate of the men fighting on the island is, in large measure, being decided by the battle the Navy is waging at sea. For both the Americans and the Japanese, the ability to land troops and supplies on the island and to prevent the other side from doing so has become the focal point of the struggle. The long-running battle picks up new urgency after Japanese naval commanders receive an erroneous report that Imperial troops have captured Henderson Field. With the Marine bombers based on Henderson taken out of the equation, they feel victory is certain and that the time has come for a decisive showdown. The Japanese Second Fleet, consisting of 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, and their destroyer escorts, sails for Guadalcanal. Soon after leaving, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake learns that the Army has not taken Henderson, but has instead been soundly defeated. Despite the discouraging news, he continues on his course, confident that his force will be more than enough to finish off the American fleet and put Henderson out of commission. The American battle groups are centered around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet and the battleship Washington, and 26 October finds them frantically searching for Nobutake's approaching fleet. Almost simultaneously, Japanese and American patrols spot each other's carriers. Aerial strike forces are immediately launched. With the Enterprise temporarily hidden in a squall, the Japanese concentrate their attack on the Hornet. Several bomb hits and 2 torpedoes in her engine room leave the foundering ship dead in the water. Leaving the shattered Hornet to be finished off the next day, another flight of Japanese planes finds the Enterprise and launches its attack. Faring far better than her doomed sister, the Enterprise sustains 2 hits but is able to withdraw in operational condition. Meanwhile, aircraft from the 2 American carriers give the Imperial Navy a taste of its own medicine. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers inflict heavy damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku, rendering her useless for flight operations. They also deal a devastating blow to the heavy cruiser Chimkuma and leave a gaping hole in the flight deck of the light carrier Zuiho. The destruction of the Wasp leaves the Enterprise the only American fleet carrier in the Pacific. While that may be a tactical victory for the Japanese, it is also a costly one. The Japanese carrier's air complement is so devastated that there aren't enough planes to launch an effective strike on Henderson Field. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground has turned decidedly against the Japanese. Unable to land sufficient reinforcements, and with the Marines attacking east and west out of their beachhead, Japanese commanders feel control of the island slipping from their hands. On 7 November, Japanese commanders land an advance party west of the Americans at Tassafaronga and intend to land the rest of the 38th Division after Henderson Field has been taken out. That task is assigned to Admiral Hiroaki Abe and his task force en route to Guadalcanal. On 12 November, the Japanese step up their air attacks against targets both on Guadalcanal and offshore in Iron Bottom Sound, where tons of Allied and Japanese shipping have settled to their final resting place. On 12 November, Rear Admiral Richmond Turner dispatches Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan with 8 destroyers and 5 cruisers to intercept Abe's force and prevent the bombardment of Henderson. In the pre-dawn hours of 13 November, the 2 forces blunder into each other. A quick, vicious duel ensues. Both sides lose 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, but almost all of the Japanese ships suffer damage, including Abe's flagship, the battleship Hiei. On the 14th, aircraft from Henderson Field score heavily against Japanese transports, and American commanders, realizing the battle is at a decisive point, bring up the battleships Washington and South Dakota. The 2 forces clash again. The South Dakota is hit and forced out of the battle, but the Washington fires salvo after salvo into the Kirishima, the last Japanese battleship in the area. Within minutes, the massive Rising Sun dreadnought is plummeting to the ocean floor. The operation the Japanese launched in hopes of destroying the American fleet and gaining total control of Guadalcanal has been a disaster for the Imperial Navy. Not only have they failed in their attempts to strengthen their deteriorating position on the island, they have lost their advantage on the seas. If they cannot regain the upper hand, Guadalcanal will be lost. That, most assuredly, will have implications reaching far beyond the battle for a single island. November 1942, French North Africa. With Allied troops ashore in Algeria and French Morocco, the first goal of Operation Torch has been accomplished. Still, there is no time for the Allies to congratulate themselves. They landed planning a fast drive across North Africa, and if that is to happen, the Vichy French troops positioned between the Allies and the Nazis must be persuaded to lay down their arms. Unfortunately, General Henri Giraud, the man the Allies had counted on to convince his countrymen to yield, seems to hold little sway with the French in North Africa. It has become apparent that Admiral Jean-François Darlan, commander of the French Navy, is the only man in a position to speak for the Vichy government. It is critical that he be brought on board quickly if the Allied plan is to succeed. Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower learns quickly that commanding the combined Allied force can involve more political problems than military ones. The British are against dealing with Darlan, as is Admiral William Leahy of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They believe Darlan is an opportunist who will do or say anything to save his own skin. Even more virulently opposed to dealing with Darlan or anyone else in the Vichy regime is Charles de Gaulle, the commander of the Free French forces in England. While Eisenhower has no delusions about Darlan or his motives, he makes his decision based purely on military necessity. Right now, he needs Darlan in order to accomplish the mission at hand. On the 10th, as General George Patton's forces begin moving into the outskirts of Casablanca, Darlan broadcasts an order to all Vichy forces in North Africa to cease resistance. What had loomed as a major battle becomes instead a simple walkthrough. Hitler is furious and orders German troops to occupy Vichy France, and on the 11th, the Wehrmacht pours across the border. The French offer no resistance. As the hobnailed boots of the Wehrmacht sound on the cobblestone streets of southern France, Italian forces occupy the island of Corsica, and the Luftwaffe feverishly transports troops and equipment into French-held Tunisia. For all intents and purposes, the country of France ceases to exist. The drive to the east begins with a landing by British troops who capture Bougie on the 11th, and an airborne assault against Bonn on the 12th. There is little resistance, and the Allies rushed reinforcements to secure these forward positions. On the 13th, Darlan gets his reward for dealing with the Allies. A formal agreement recognizing him as the head of the French civil government in North Africa. Giraud is named leader of French military forces. While not an ideal arrangement, it has certainly saved the lives of many American and British soldiers. With political necessities set aside, Eisenhower is now able to focus his attention on the Germans. Their buildup in Tunisia has been more rapid than Allied military planners believed possible. By the 15th, they have over 10,000 troops in place, and what was supposed to be a relatively easy drive into Tunisia is proving much more difficult. For the moment, however, the Luftwaffe poses the greatest threat to continued Allied success. Enjoying overwhelming air superiority, German air crews are able to strike at Allied supply lines with impunity. Several critical supply ships are sunk during the landing operations at Bougie, and almost no Allied movement on land or sea goes uncontested from the air. Although there are far tougher tests ahead, Eisenhower is pleased with the success of the operation thus far. He has successfully negotiated difficult political obstacles. His raw recruits have given a good accounting in their first taste of battle. Perhaps most important, however, the Allied combined command structure has worked wonderfully. As word spreads of progress in North Africa, the peoples of the United States and Britain share Eisenhower's optimism. They know it will be a long, bloody struggle to rid the world of Hitler and his fascist brood. But with Operation Torch, they have taken the first step toward Berlin, the first step toward victory, and perhaps most important, for the GIs on the ground, it is the first step toward home. November 1942, Stalingrad. For months, the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, has continued to expend huge quantities of men and equipment, trying to capture Stalingrad, and they have nearly succeeded in doing so. But the cost of this conquest has been enormous. The Russians' defense of Stalingrad has been fanatical, and the campaign, which was to have concluded in late August, now threatens to drag on into the winter. With his supply lines stretched to the breaking point and his men exhausted, von Paulus finds himself in command of an army too weak and weary to advance any further. It is precisely this point in the conflict that the Russians have been waiting for. At 7:32 a.m., 3,500 guns of the Soviet 5th Tank Army Artillery split the icy morning air 110 miles northwest of Stalingrad. This is the opening barrage of a carefully planned and perfectly timed counteroffensive designed to cut off the German salient at the root. Despite the temptation to throw every available soldier into the defense of the city, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and his Deputy Commander-in-Chief Georgy Zhukov have been building up reserves of men and machinery, releasing the bare minimums necessary to keep Stalingrad from being overrun. Now, as the big guns ease up, the first of nearly 1 million fresh Russian troops, hungry for the blood of the enemy, charge into the Axis front lines. In what hindsight may reveal to be a terrible mistake, the Nazis, intent on employing German soldiers in the battle at Stalingrad, have left the lines to the north and south of the city in the hands of the much less formidable Romanian armed forces. The 3rd Romanian Army catches the brunt of the attack and virtually crumbles under the onslaught. In no time, the Soviet troops have broken through and begin driving hard and fast to the southwest. By the time the sun comes up on 20 November, the Russians are ready to begin Phase 2 of the counteroffensive. 25 miles to the south of Stalingrad, elements of the Russian 51st, 57th, and 64th Armies attack to the northwest. Once again, it is Romanian troops, specifically the 4th Army, trying to hold the line. Despite assistance from the German 4th Panzer Army, they are only slightly more successful. The Russians make rapid advances. With the Red Army driving both north and south, it quickly becomes clear to General von Paulus and the German High Command in Berlin what the Soviet intentions are: to link up their two forces to the west of Stalingrad, and in doing so, surround the 6th Army. In desperation, von Paulus's commanders order him to break off his engagement in the city and prepare to attack to his rear. But before he can move into position, the order is rescinded. Adolf Hitler, unwilling to allow retreat under any circumstance, has ordered the 6th Army to stay put. By 21 November, the Red Army troops pushing south have broken through on a 50-mile front and are continuing to advance. Those pushing north encounter slightly stiffer resistance, but in the end, the sheer size of the attacking force is too much for the Axis troops, and the Russians continue to run roughshod over any opposition. On 23 November, near the town of Kalach, the Soviet forces link up, cutting German supply lines and trapping the entire 6th Army. Stalin and Zhukov are more than pleased. They have won the battle, taking a page from the German military genius Clausewitz, a classic pincers movement executed at the precise moment the enemy, overextended and exhausted, is most vulnerable. Still, having won the battle, the Soviets are a long way from having won the war, and the road ahead is paved with peril. Stalin and Zhukov believe they have trapped 65,000 Germans. In fact, the number is closer to 300,000, which will make the task of clearing out the encircled area a great deal more difficult than they anticipate. Nevertheless, Stalin cannot help but be pleased. In a mere 4 days, he has gone from the brink of disaster to glorious victory. He has turned the tide of the battle and very possibly the entire war. Amid the horrors and heartache that war inevitably brings, there also exists a fertile soil in which the human spirit can grow, attaining sometimes heroic proportions. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the call to arms in this war is not the noble actions of the young men drawn away from their homes by the need to exorcise an external evil, but the way it has revitalized and unified the United States. The people on the home front have stood behind their warriors, not just in word, but in deed, turning factories and laboratories into battlefields, sacrificing many of the comforts to which they have grown accustomed, so that their brothers, sons, fathers, and husbands might return home safe and victorious. As Americans grew more conscious of the hostilities brewing in Europe and Asia, FDR began steering the national economy from a peacetime to a wartime footing. Despite rampant isolationism and at considerable political risk, he declared that the U.S. would become the arsenal of democracy and began the process of ramping up the country's manufacturing capability, not for the domestic good, but for the sake of beleaguered people around the world. As the fighting raged overseas, the U.S. government went through several stages of attitude and policy regarding the release of armaments to foreign countries. Initially, the public insisted America remain neutral, and under a cash-and-carry policy, any country with the means could purchase American goods and weapons. As public sentiment turned more decisively against the Axis powers, the policy shifted to the more generous Lend-Lease plan. To keep up with the increased demand, primarily from Great Britain, production of war goods and the ships in which to carry them more than doubled within a year. The final step in the transformation of the country from the economic wreck of the 30s to the manufacturing juggernaut of today began on 7 December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor instantly awakened the United States to the inevitability of its participation in the war. Almost overnight, the demeanor of the country changed. With President Roosevelt's declaration of war, the national spirit galvanized. Everyone understood that it was not only the soldiers, but the people at home who would have to fight the war. People across the country forgot their suddenly insignificant peacetime woes and, leaving behind the lives they'd always known, flocked to the great manufacturing centers of the Northwest and Midwest. They converged on shipyards, factories, ironworks, and converted automobile plants, and began churning out planes, tanks, guns, and ammunition by the shipload, with men and women working side by side on the manufacturing lines. Focusing on the needs of the military, the nation is instituting a restrictive rationing program. People are farming in their own backyards, and the nation is mounting the greatest recycling movement the world has ever known. Just as important as manufacturing to the process is the act of invention. Scientists, engineers, and technicians bring their training and ingenuity to bear in government-sponsored think tanks, improving existing weapons and creating new ones they hope will end the war that much sooner. American tools of warfare, extraordinary efforts have gone into shipbuilding. Under the aegis of the U.S. Navy, rapidly mass-produced transports called Liberty ships carry men and materiel across the vast expanses of ocean to the fields of battle. With the coming of the Second World War, it seems as if the United States has found its destiny. Americans have come together, lifting the precious raw materials from their land, shaping them with their minds and hands, and turning them against their enemies. Those who would trample the freedom of people around the world are now being brought to task, not only by an alliance of countries united in arms, but by one great nation, united in spirit.